Welcome, everyone. This is the second September OpenNTF webinar. Today's topic is Unleashing the Power of One-Touch Setup, and our presenter is Daniel Nashed. Daniel is, for those that don't know, a wonderful contributor to the community and a leader, lifetime IBM champion and lifetime HCL ambassador. So we thank him for his time. Very quickly, the agenda, we're going to jump right into the presentation and then we'll hold questions for the end, just like normal. Just a quick thank you to our sponsors. I mentioned in the last webinar that we're looking at revising our sponsorship model, but for the time being, we have two very generous sponsors. HCL has helped to make these things a reality in terms of the activities that we do, and Prominic donates all of our IT infrastructure and related support. So we thank both those organizations for help. And just a quick note about the community, again, always looking for contributions. And it isn't so much that people should wait for us to say, hey, we've got this initiative or that initiative going on. Jesse, in conversation a while back, mentioned that if there was something that was neat and he thought it was fun and wanted to write some code and make it happen, he was going to do that and contribute it to the community. And we encourage everybody to think that way. If you come up with a neat solution, by all means, do not think that somebody else has done it before you. It could very well be that somebody solved that problem a different way, and this is another way for us to learn. So we all learn from each other when we contribute like that, and we encourage everybody to do so. Quick note about upcoming events. So our webinar for next month is already scheduled for October 17th. It's going to be on the dev side using passkeys for Domino web authentication. And a previous presenter, Paul Harrison, out of the UK, is going to come back and give that presentation. And also in October, we've got the Let's Connect Nordic user group happening in Oslo and Stockholm on October 22nd and 24th. And as far as I know, they've got some good registration, still room for people to attend if they want to. This is going to be an in-person event, both in Oslo and Stockholm, and check out their website for more information. Quick note about Discord. This is how OpenNTF services the community online. We've got lots of discussions and places to ask your questions and share your ideas. If you go to openntf.org/discord, that link will take you to the registration page, or you can just use the QR code on the screen. With respect to asking questions during the presentation, we've got the GoToWebinar questions panel that you can ask in. And we're not going to answer questions during the presentation and demos. We'll save them all for the end and give Daniel the chance to come back and answer them and be able to show demonstrations, if necessary and that kind of thing. But ultimately, for them to be recorded, this session is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube either later today or tomorrow. And that's where we want you to ask your questions. And with that, Daniel, I will make you presenter.
So, welcome everyone. Thanks for the nice introduction, Graham. So let me go into the introduction first. So let me explain to you why I'm doing this session. I've been a contributor to the one-touch setup from the very beginning. I was involved in the first code drops, gave a lot of feedback, and I was using it from the very first day when it came up. Also, I am the maintainer of the Domino start script and the Domino container project, community projects on GitHub, and they both leverage one-touch integration. And I will show you a little bit about this integration later on. But the focus here is really on the one-touch setup itself and not so much on container projects and other projects, right? So the main focus is what is this all about and how you can integrate it, how you can leverage it. And in my different roles as an administrator, developer, architect, and troubleshooter, I also provide glue to make one-touch even more flexible for you, right? Putting this into those different community projects and adding additional stuff that you will see later on today. So we have 90 minutes and I only have 20 content slides. How does that work? I will do a lot of demos and we will look into live resources after I explain the basics about one-touch setup, the different methods that we have, how you leverage it, and how you customize it. And also, I will give you details on how you can mix this up with existing other setup routines that you have for agents and others, right? And last but not least, I will show you, beside the resources, also some very advanced examples. And I have a small surprise for you as well at the end. So why would you want to use one-touch setup? In today's IT environments, DevOps is one of the key elements that many people look into. So it's about how you operate and develop your software and how you test your software. So one-touch setup plays a major role in this space because it helps you to bring up server environments. So after you installed a server with silent install, you have to bring it up in an automated way. And one-touch setup helps you to do that very efficient in the same way always with a standardized and reproducible setup. So I have many environments where I use one-touch setup for testing, for production, and this is like something I couldn't live without, right, anymore. So this is not limited to container environments or Kubernetes. It works on Windows as well. So you can also bring up your Windows servers with one-touch setup in the same way you do it on Linux, for example. So where are we coming from? So many of you recall the GUI setup. The GUI setup had a way, it's based on Java. You see this on the screen. There's a little Java icon. So the one-touch, the normal standard setup was something that you could customize. So it has a Java serialized file, a PDS file, and that you could modify and try to bring up your server in a custom way. The first Domino container project that was still at IBM, and Thomas Hampel introduced it. He was the initiator of that. He came up with this. And this was until one-touch setup came up. This was the way that we worked with automating setups. So when we came to Domino 12, Thomas, as the product manager, had the idea to bring this into Domino. And Domino 12 Plus has one-touch setup as one of the major ways to set up Domino. Some older methods are going away. For example, in 14.5, the GUI setup on Linux is going away completely. The remote setup will remain, but the X window based setup is going away. But you don't really need this if you have one-touch setup. So it is a cross-platform approach, and it works. It works just. I would show you in a minute how you invoke that. And there are two different ways doing it. It works for first and additional servers, and it's extended in every release. And the interesting part here is there is some extra in one-touch setup that you only get when you use one-touch setup. So if you do a classical setup, the TLS setup is not able to you can't automate that. ID vault is not created. The Domino CA that is is started to be supported for automation is since 14.0 is not available, right? So really, I would encourage you to look into one-touch setup. Even if you just use the basic one-touch setup, it's always the better approach for a setup. And you will see it's really easy. So let's have a look. We have two different ways to configure servers with one-touch setup. The more simple way that you could start is you use environment variables. So you would just put in the basic parameters. I put this up here for a first server setup and for an additional server setup. The difference here is the first server setup will set up your whole domain with everything, with ID Vault, if you configure it with the Domino CA, cert manager, and additional servers need to connect to the first server, and you specify the server name plus the IP address or DNS name, and then it will talk to the first server, get its system databases, very much the same as for the normal setup, right? You only have to specify those parameters, and then you can trigger it with another environment variable. So if you set this environment variable, setup auto configure equal 1, and you set those other parameters, when you start your server, it will invoke the one-touch setup automatically, and your server will come up and work. Similar with the additional server setup. This is the very basic, and you have mainly the parameters from the classical setup. It has also some additional parameters, but let's have a look into the second way first. So there's another way using JSON files, and the first parameters, and I will show you all the details, and we look into examples later. They are one by one. So if you flip between the screens, you see that the names here of the variables really match what you see in the JSON. It's just a different kind of format. Why is this JSON? Because there is something in addition to the basic setup, which I explain later on, which is called the application setup. And the application setup is only available for the JSON approach, right? So I would encourage you to look into the JSON files. It is a little bit more complex to start with and get the JSON written, but maybe we have a surprise later for a tool that helps you doing that. So the additional application configuration only available for the JSON files can create database, you can create documents, update documents, and much more. All right. It's one single file, and it contains all the details. And it is first looking a little bit complicated, but if you know a little bit about JSON, and most of you do, it's not that complicated. So I put a reference to JSON, what it really is, and which format it is. Usually it's UTF-8. So Domino uses UTF-8 without the byte order mark. So there are a couple of bytes, 3 bytes in front of the UTF, usually to show that this is UTF. In this case, you don't have to pass that in. ASCII is, by the way, a subset of UTF-8. So when you write everything in ASCII, you always save. ASCII means it works with UTF-8, right? There are some tools out there that you could use to look into JSON. JQ is the most popular one, especially on Linux, but it's also available on Windows. So if you want to look into JSON and parse it and test it, JQ is your friend. It's available everywhere, also on the Mac. And if you are a developer and you want to work with JSON in C, there is something called Rapid JSON, which is, by the way, also used by Domino. And it's really powerful, fast, and not that complicated. It is, by the way, implemented just as header files. So you have nothing to link with. It's just a bunch of files that you include in your project, and that will make it work. I have an example later on where I use Rapid JSON to validate the JSON format for you. So how do you invoke one-touch JSON setup? There are two different ways, and it pretty much depends on your use case. So you can either run it from command line and say server autoconfig, and then you specify the JSON file. You should usually do that with the full paths to make sure that it's always finding the right file. You can also shortcut this. You can say -a and then setup JSON, but it would be like invocation on command line in the right directory where you have the server, right? You need the you need on Linux, you need to be in the data directory, you need to be the right user, right? All those requirements still apply. And that would trigger the setup for you. That's one way. In container environments, but this is not just limited to container environments, you would specify the file name, and you would say setup autoconfigure equal 1, like in the environment setup. So this tells Domino do an autoconfig setup, but instead of use the environment variables, use this JSON file. This is pretty much the basic about one-touch setup. So I will go into details. We can look into files a little bit later, but let me first introduce what we have in addition on the JSON file. So the JSON file has another section called the app configuration section. And you see here we have one database that we create. So you have actions like create, update, where you can just really create a database from scratch. So this section here just says action is create. The file path is discussion NSF. I give it a title, I give it a template, and I say sign it user admin P. So this really brings up a new discussion database with your new server. That's it. Simple as that. There are many more options. You can modify the ECL, you can create documents and all those kind of things. So on the right-hand side, you see, for example, I update names a document in names NSF. So in this case, I say update means the database already exists. I have now a document section where I say, here's a document, find the document, type is server name is equal this, and then I update the homepage, the full access admins, and for create access, I also add local domain admins. That's it. In addition, I have like here an example of creating a configuration document for your server. Actually, not for your server. This is a star configuration document. So star here means it's the default, use as default, and the server name is star. Form is server config. Action is create, and then what I do here is I say compute with form. That means when you put in the basic values that are needed, the compute with form puts all the remaining values that that form has as a default. So you don't need to specify all the values, you only specify what you would normally type in, and everything else is added for you. But this means you have to use the compute with form. Those are two very simple starting point examples. We look into more, but we want to first understand the whole concept with all the details before we go into examples and look into real world setups. Let's take the next step. You see here in my example that I have a text list. So this is a JSON array. And you also see that this item has additional flags. So it's a names field, it's a resource field, it's an author field, it's protected, it's a signed item, and it should be encrypted, and it's a summary item. So you don't have to specify all of those, but in my example, I put all of those because I want to show you what can be done. They're all optional, and by default, it is just a summary field with none of those options, right? So something new in Domino 14 is a date time range and multi-value field, which is, for example, important when you want to create a connection document. So in this case, you would specify like from midnight to midnight. And this is like when you know date times in nodes, they're really also difficult to handle in Lotus script. In here, it's pretty simple. You just have an array and you say from to, right? And this is the present representation is the ISO time date. You can specify date only or time only. In this case, it's time only. You will see examples later on with more details, and you can look them up later on. So in here, we're looking into the basic principles, right? And you don't need to remember all the details right now. But you see that some of this is really evolving over time. So in Domino 14, we have the formula search based, for example, new. I didn't put an example here, but I have one later on. So instead of specifying the find document with type and server, you can really specify a formula, and that might be helpful in some of the scenarios. And response documents are also new in 14.0. They are especially useful when you create internet sites, for example. Okay, so when you have a JSON format, it's very simple to get it wrong. So there are two different levels of validation. So the JSON itself can be validated with JQ or any other tool. And it's probably easier to use JQ than what Domino has built in, because what Domino has built in needs the path to your data directory and binary directory. And if you just want to build a tool that validates the JSON, you just use JQ. But maybe you want to completely validate if all the parameters that you passed in are valid. Not everyone knows that JSON also has a schema. So we know from XML that it is really schema based, but JSON schemas are also available, right? So in case of Domino, the JSON schema for the one-touch setup is part of Domino. It is shipped with Domino in the binary directory. And there is a command line tool, valid JSON, which is a Domino binary. It's on the server, and you could run it with valid JSON, the JSON file, and then you specify the schema. If you put in -default, it would find the standard Domino schema for JSON. You can also, and this is, I don't know, new in 12.02, I think. I'm not exactly sure, but it wasn't in the first versions. It's under configuration, tools, server, valid JSON. So you can also do that from your admin client. That's especially useful when you build it first and then put it on your server. But in some cases, you don't have a Domino server yet, right, on your system, and you don't have Domino installed or Nodes client somewhere installed. So there are also ways to validate a JSON file against the schema with RapidJSON. So I put a simple example how to do that as a tool into the GitHub repository that I'm talking about in a minute. So you can just compile that. It has instruction how to compile it on Linux and Windows, and it will just work in the same way, right? So you don't need a Domino server and client. So there's an aha idea saying that it should work without Domino dependencies. But currently the binary is built with dependencies. So I just went and built this very simple tool. It's just like a page of C code, or actually it's C++ code. It's a C++ wrapper, the wrapped JSON. Okay, so if it still fails, so it can happen that you have one touch setup completely right setup, but a server is not responding. The content of the parameters didn't work together. Like if you have a server document with server name A and and you have something configured which is not matching this name, then you could like have a runtime error on the setup. The good news is there's a log file. The bad news is the error messages right now are not necessarily always speaking, but there is something in work that the errors are checked a little bit more careful and that you get the right kind of error messages. So it gives you a clue what is happening, and this is the first part where you should look into. But sometimes it's hard to find out what really the problem is, and this is going to be enhanced in Domino 14.5. So I spoke with the guys responsible for OneTouch, and they have this in their backlog. So especially when you have an additional server set up, if you have connection issues between the two servers, it is quite likely that you get an error message, right? What is also interesting to know, not all operations will fail the one-touch setup. So there are, for example, some post-installation operations. So when you register users and they need to be uploaded into the vault, this is an operation that cannot be performed while the server is configured. So those operations are invoked after the server has been fully configured and is starting. So it really has some code that goes and talks to your server over the loopback interface and uploads the IDs to the vault. This can fail in some scenarios, and this will be logged in the auto configure log, but it will not fail your setup. As I mentioned, there are enhancements in every version. I listed most of them here. I tested this week the seed functionality, which was a little bit tricky, and I will write up a blog post about it. This can help you when in a test environment, or if you're on a ship, right, where you send the system databases, you can then create a one-touch setup that specifies a directory where all the files are located. And there's one little bug that I found and that needs to be corrected before it fully works, because the names.nsf needs to be in the data directory currently. There's a lookup. Oops, sorry for that. There's a lookup to the data directory, and this is going to be fixed hopefully in 14.5. So there's already a SPR in place for it. So I highlighted already the find document by formula, which is interesting because it can do much more than what you would do with a simple search where you specify the fields. It can create full text indexes. And we have the certificate authority that is created automatically for the first server, which is important for the new feature Admin Central, because that requires that you have the Domino CA setup. So the team put this into the one-touch configuration of the first server of a domain. Okay, so this was the first part, but we will look into details and refine what we just have seen in a minute. So you might have seen that the Domino help for one-touch setup is not always necessarily fully helpful. So the one-touch team came up with the idea for a GitHub project, and I'm part of the team that works on the one-touch setup. So I'm one of the maintainers, and you will see most of the examples currently coming from me. Those examples and some additional code snippets are probably more helpful than the reference. So a reference always lists all the parameters, but it doesn't tell you how to use them. So this repository has some documentation, it has full examples, and it also has some additional resources, which I explain in a minute. So we have like an agent approach to run code snippets that you have as an agent. So let me shift a little bit to, actually I shift to my browser, and you see here's the one-touch repository. It has no GitHub pages right now. Maybe we will do one a little bit later, but for now, the structure is pretty simple. You have the README where all the information is located, and then you have some example directory. We have the one-touch agent, and we have a full Domino lab setup that we will look into a little bit later. So here's the project that I just spoke about. So here's it starts with what I just explained, the environment variable setup with examples. And the good part here is instead of going to screen shots or slides, you can just go in here and copy to your clipboard, right? So all the examples are clickable and consumable right from the GitHub repository. You don't even need to clone it. So I explain the JSON format, I give you some more examples, and this is really step by step in here. But we don't need to go through all of this. We looked into it already. You see my examples in the slide deck are from here. What I want to show you is examples. Here I have an example that has a little bit more than what you would expect. Let me switch this to raw mode because it's maybe easier to read. So when we look into the one-touch setup, so this first part from here to here is the setup. And the next part over here is the application configuration, right? So let's focus for a moment on the first part. So I go through what kind of options you have. So most of it is optional, but I want you to really understand we have two different parts. This application configuration part is separate and only available on the JSON format. Everything that you see here on the top is something that is also doable with the environment setup. But because you will end up at some point anyhow doing application setup, I would directly start with the JSON format, right? If you have a simple server and you will just bring it up, you can use the environment variable setup. But really, in most cases, you want the JSON setup. So here you see the separate sections. And the separate sections with the ini variables, they all have underscores between them, right? You have server setup and underscore server and type and so on, right? They have all the same representations, right? But here it is better structured, and I find it's easier to read because this part is really the server setup part. We say this is the first server, your server name, the title, no password, the server task, that's it. Next part is what you know from earlier setups as the network part, where you say this is your host name, the port encryption and compression. Then you have the organizational part, where you specify your organizational certifier. You have the admin. Then you have a section for the nodes INIs. This is pretty simple, right? Right, straightforward. And then the last part that you know from the normal setup is you can say change the ECL of all your databases to no access for anonymous, right? And add local domain admins to all your databases. So up to here, this is the normal setup that you know from the classical setup. And everything in addition here is only available on one-touch setup. One little note, the casing is important. So we have camel case, but the first letter is always lowercase, right? We have some exceptions when parameters start with like a known abbreviation. A CA is always uppercase, and TLS, the T is always uppercase because the whole term is uppercase. But beside that, it always starts with a lowercase character, and then some parameters have like camel case, or in this case, ID, for example, is also something that is always typed uppercase. So the rule is it's camel case, the first letter is lowercase, and if you have fixed terms, they are all uppercase. But you will see this in all the examples, and you see this in the help reference. Okay, so the next part here is, in my case, the TLS setup. And in this case, I'm creating a micro CA certificates, but there are multiple options in here. You could import an existing PEM file or a P12 file, PKCS12 file. What you can't do out of the box, and this is on purpose, is Let's Encrypt or ACME in general, because it's very likely people get this wrong because the server is not properly set up and connected to the internet now at that moment when you set it up. But the good news is you can do it with the application part, and I will show that in my last example. You can register users. The user registration has two parts. One is like the defaults that will count for every user unless you specify something different. So you could have a default password, or you can say everything should be full text index. So this is really giving you a chance to add standards, and then here everything that you don't set will be taken from here. Very simple, right? So in my case, I'm registering one additional user. One side note here, the first user, the admin user that you select, this guy is not going to ID Vault, and I think this would be a very good enhancement. But currently, including 14.5 Early Access 1, this user is not put into ID Vault. That means you can't use it for Nomad. You can use it for a remote setup because it puts the user into the user ID into the person document, what we usually don't want. But because you don't have an ID vault, it's putting it into the person document. But all those additional users, this is one user, you can have an array of many users, will be automatically uploaded to ID vault. So you specify it, which is the next step in here. So here is the ID vault configuration. It is split in multiple sections, the ID vault configuration itself in here, then the security policy section here, and then the master policy piece here. A good advice here would be copy what I have and modify only what you need, because the naming can be tricky. So if you specify the ID vault name in the wrong way, it will fail, right? And also the name of the ID vault needs to be a special name, else it will fail. So I would start with what I have and mock it and change it, mock around with it, right? So that's it. This is the basic part, and this is how you can get your server working. So the next part is really to customize your server. And customizing your server would mean, for example, you find your server document and you set up a bunch of fields. I put like transaction log settings, HTTP settings, TLS settings, SSL settings for all the internet protocols. I put in the ciphers. And this pretty much is all additional information that goes into the server document, right? The fault notification goes to the admins. So we could go on. It's like all the fields that you can set. And you would say, oh, do I really need to make this all up on my own? There will be a tool that I would show later. Don't be afraid of setting this manually. So you can create your one-touch configurations and customize them. You don't need to fill all the fields, only the fields that you want. And this is the first example of updating an existing document. So it says, go to your Domino directory to names NSF, find your server document, and then modify values. My next example here is in the same database. So this, you see, this is an array of documents. The first document starts here. This is my, so you see, it's an array. It's starting with like a bracket. And then here, all of this makes up the first document. And then the second document starts afterwards here. And this document is really a server configuration document, as I showed you earlier, just with a little bit more of details. Another one here, this is crafting an internet site for a web server. This one is an SMTP inbound site. And so step by step, you make up your server, right? So IMAP configuration. In fact, this is an example that is coming from one of my automation tests where I really test the server, including IMAP protocol, LDAP protocol, and so on. A POP3 site. We don't need to go through all of that. You see the basics, right? You understand the concept. Here's a global domain document with aliases. That's it. Next is I configure a DOM CFG, creating a document. I create a inodes redirect database. And this will bring up a whole server with everything on it. I find this pretty cool, and this is really helpful. But you might not want to do all the work all the time and specify it manually. So maybe we can do something more clever and make it like a template where you can just fill in the values. I'll show that in a minute. But this is how it really looks like. And I can really only recommend that as a starting point. So don't go to help first. Visit this GitHub repository. Look into my basic explanations here. If you have questions, raise issues in this project, or you can also put contributions if you have good examples. But also if you have questions about OneTouch, maybe this is the best place to place them, right? You can open an issue in the GitHub project, and probably me is going to answer the questions because I'm monitoring this repository. Okay, so the next part. So OneTouch setup can sign databases, but they are signed with the server ID using admin P. And when you use admin P, we all know this is not an inline operation. So it is a request that is put into admin P, and then it runs, gives you some ugly messages on the console about signing. This is actually debug, which is going away in 14.5, early access 2. And you get a proper message that your database is signed. But still, this is an asynchronous operation. And if you want to use an agent, while you set up your server, this doesn't help you. But there is something that is not obvious in the documentation. So I put this into the OneTouch repository as an example. I built a little OTS helper that I can invoke that can do additional things. So, and the key here is, so in the app configuration, and you see my example, it's always starting with app configuration to show where we are, right? App configuration, databases. I have this database, and that means the action is update, not create. And then we have an agent section. And here's the interesting part. There's agent run, but there's also agent sign. And the operations work in, like, no matter how you specify them, it will sign. If you specify sign and run, it obviously does the signing always first, and then it runs the agent, right? So this gives you the opportunity to not only use one-touch setup to bring up your server, but you can mix and match it with what you already have. So, for example, if you have already an application set up, or you plan to distribute an application, why would you rewrite all this configuration in JSON, right? So there is a saying that I know for like almost 25 years or longer: if you only have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So it would work and you could do it, but it's probably not the best way. So I would recommend that you really think twice what you want to put into one-touch setup and what do you want to put into agents. So you can run multiple agents. Each application can have their own agents. And in the container projects, we have a way to distribute databases. So it's called custom data zip. And you can even remotely download it while the server is configured, and then you can just run it, right? So it can be part of your application. The only important part is really that you specify the sign option. So let's look into an example. So I wrote a small database, and in the container project, you could specify it even by going to like specify really the Git content, right? I put it on Git in this Git one-touch setup configuration, and here's the zip file. If your server has internet connectivity, you can just specify an environment variable, say custom nodes data zip. Then it puts that into your data directory and extracts it for you. And then in my project, in my simple nodes database, I'm leveraging this OTS helper, and I specify this in my configuration, then done. This includes downloads the database, unzips it, and runs the agent. In addition, what I also have in place here for the container project, we can download a save ID file, and it's put into your data directory. So this project has the option to cross-certify a database, an ID, and it's using Lotus Script for it. It can also enable auto update on the server, which requires the Domino directory profile to be updated. And this is currently not possible in one-touch setup. So I'm leveraging this agent on the one hand side as an example for what you can do with agents, and also to provide a helper agent that you could download, customize, use as it is, and it's triggered by environment variables. So you set environment variables, and those environment variables are consumed by the agent logic, and all the agent and everything is in the GitHub project. Okay, so this is already pretty cool, but maybe we can do better. So you don't want to always have JSON built for every server. So what about doing templates? So what about combining the best of both worlds? On the one hand side, you could have a JSON format, and then you have placeholders like you have in Helm or in Ansible, where you just specify environment variables and let some component, and I will explain what components can do it in a minute, but I want to give you the basic idea about what it does first. So some component would just replace the variables, right? So, and why don't we name the variables that we have exactly like the variables that Domino uses for one-touch setup with environment variables. So we use the best of both worlds. We use a JSON format with placeholders, like in this case here, you say server name, and then you put in this angle bracket style. And this allows you to put the server name in, right? And in combination with environment variables and this JSON file, you can bring up any kind of server. So what you also do with this approach is, on the one hand side, you have a setup like a build plan for your server, but all the data, including passwords and everything, are coming from your environment. So you could even download this template from wherever you want, from a GitHub repository. The container project has ways to download, and the container project also replaces the variables for you. So this is a mix and match approach, and I call this one-touch setup templating. So the container project supports it, the start script supports it, and I can show that in examples. But here you see really it needs to be put into a specific place. Currently, it's local nodes data, Domino autoconfig template JSON, and then the Domino Linux server with my start script will automatically pick it up and replace the environment variables, right? So in the container world, you can say setup autoconfig template download. So it would download it, for example, from my server, right? But we also have an interactive mode. When you run the Domino start script in this mode, you say Domino setup, or in the container project, there's a Domino control. You can run Domino control, and it will show you the variables and replace them for you automatically. So it prompts you for variables. And you could even go wild and say Domino setup, and then you give it a URL, and it will grab the JSON for you and ask you about the parameters, and your server will be set up. So let me show that to you very quickly, how this looks like. Martijn showed this in his presentation, but now with context, it might make a little bit more sense. So I have like a container environment. I put in Domino control. I say setup. And the project comes with predefined 2 sets of JSON files. And those JSON files have the placeholders. And when I choose the first server setup, it prompts you already for example values. If you don't do anything, it will just take those variables. And then what it does for you, it uses the one-touch validation and says, oh, successful, it's done. When you run it again, it presents to you the one-touch setup. And let me break one of the parameters. I set something to a wrong value. I save it. And you see that the schema validation that Domino has tells you that this parameter is wrong. So you can go back in, change the parameter back. Where did I change it? The xorg. You save it again, and that's it. So now you have a one-touch configuration, and you could bring up your server with this configuration. So what this project does, it will spin up a Domino container and will copy the one-touch setup into the running container, and the container knows that it needs to wait a couple of seconds if someone drops a JSON file in. So if no JSON file is present, it will fall back to listen mode on port 1352. But if you put in a JSON file, it will process that JSON file automatically. This is built into the container. But I don't want to put too much focus on this. We want to really know about one-touch setup. I'm just giving you an idea how this could look like and how the template setup works. Let me go quickly back to the GitHub project. So this is the GitHub project of the start script. And in the start script, you see one-touch setup. There's a directory. Here is the first server JSON. And you see that this has all the placeholders. And what the logic does that I built into the container, it really replaces those environment variables. This is like in the DNA of the container. This is not something that I just invented a week ago. This is in all the container builds that you have, starting with Domino 1202. The HCL container has it, and the Domino community container has it, right? The Domino community container had it earlier, but we started to use the community project for the HCL shipping container with 1202. Okay, so that's this piece. So really, the templating makes a lot of sense because you don't want to do this for a single server. You want templates, and maybe we'll build up a website or put this on the website and put in like examples that have all those placeholders. And we have standardized placeholders because we know them from the one-touch setup environment variable setup, right? So they should be always the same. Okay, so the next part is really to look into more details. First, I want to show you a new database. So you see it has the new modern design. I built something for me first, a simple agent to create one touch from documents. It was a very basic thing. Now I put this into a real database, and I'm officially giving this away for free as open source. Let me show you what we have here. I plan to put some references into the databases. So for example, here is a program document. So I put in like description, tags, and so on. And then here you see only snippets, right? Those are just document snippets. So in this case, it's a program document. And you see we have those kind of template variables. That's why I explained the template variables for you first before showing you that. So here's a redirect database. It doesn't have any placeholders in our case here. The Domino config form. So those are all small snippets, and you can combine them into a real one-touch setup. So you can say export OTS JSON. You can select which tags you want to have. I want first server and my test data. You say OK, and then it creates an email document for you in my case. And here is really the one-touch JSON, a full one-touch JSON with everything on it, with the placeholders. That's already kind of cool, but I think we can do better. So let's go back here. So it's a reference, but also you can set up like servers and say, oh, I want those. It notes any settings, then it puts them in for a server configuration. So for additional and first server, I have those ini variables, and they just merged into a JSON. But maybe you want to have one touch built up from existing documents, right? So let's create a new one-touch document. Let's go to a server that I know that exists. And then take the nav. The server only has one server document. So we can say form equal server. This functionality has a little limitation because Nodes UI can only show 32K. If someone finds a way to show more than 32K in a document, please ping me and help me. I tried to get 64K at least working, but I failed. So in a normal text field, even with summary data, you can put more than 64K meanwhile. But when you want to display it on a form, I couldn't get more than 32K working. But really, we want more than 34K because you will see what it does. So I took a big example, right? Maybe we take a different one. We don't take names. We do DOM CFG is maybe an easier example. So let's do that. Import JSON. Oh, and this guy doesn't have it. Okay, DOM CFG and NSF. We go for a server that's called Pluto. Pluto import JSON docs. Maybe I type server right, then it works better. So here you see we have two documents, right? So you can do check JSON. It says, oh, two documents. When you break this guy says, check JSON. It's not working. So Jesse, very much thanks for helping me with the Java agent. Now you see where it is used. It is used to like format JSON. Lotus script can't do it. So we have a Lotus script agent on the one hand side, and it calls into Java to format the JSON, right? The formatting is all done with a Java agent. So when you muck around with this and change something, right? New lines, the indentation is changed. When you do the check JSON, it says it's okay, and it brings it back into format, right? So this also works with more complicated examples. So if you go for a server document or maybe a cross certificate, this will also work, right? So let's do names NSF. So you go in and say form equal server, press the button, and boom, you get the whole document with everything in it. And it has even the server certificate below somewhere. You don't need all those fields, but you want to use this to like grab what you need, right? I did this first for creating a cross certificate. If you take a cross certificate document and you have an existing server ID or at least cert ID on your server, and you have a test server that you bring up all the time with a new domain, you can do that once with a new certifier, and then later on seed in that certifier into your configuration, and you just once do the cross certification with your organization, and then you're good, right? You can use your normal nodes ID, and the cross certificate will just work. So it does it with the right line breaks and everything. It knows about date ranges, right, and multiple date values. So all the basic stuff works. I had some issues with Cert Manager because it has like a private key, which is not a normal nodes item. I had to exclude some item types, but the normal item types are all there, right? And this, I'm going to give this away for free because I want to help people with one touch. What I also have is like you can put in, like if you have a value and you want to put in one of the placeholders, if you don't know all the placeholders, you can go in here and say, oh, organizational name, boom, it's in here. If you want, like I have one that is like a little bit more complex. When you have the full server name, it is the server and the organization, and it's a little bit hard to type that in. So it's CN equal, then the server name, and then /O equal, and then the organizational name, right? So this gives you a way to do that. And then you can store stuff, you can put it together. There's one more thing. It has an agent called ots.json, and guess what it does? It spits out JSON. So when you call it into this database over HTTP, you can specify also the tags, as I do when I do the export here, and it will just reply with JSON, a JSON stream, right? So what you could do, in fact, is in your server configuration with the container, you could say, oh, take the one-touch JSON from this database with those tags, and boom, you're done. You only have to put in your environment variables. So that's the kind of integration that I like to do, to give you some extra glue between the different components to make your life a little bit easier. Okay, but now what about looking into a real full example to bring up multiple servers with like some more configuration? I have something prepared, and the data for that is really also in the one-touch setup project. If you go back here and you go to the Domino lab, the Domino lab has first the instructions for the lab for what it does. So it brings up a server with one-touch setup. It 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 crafts a Acme challenge for you, and if the server is connected to the internet, it will turn the micro CA certificate that you first get into a real certificate. It's using Docker Compose to bring up 3 servers. And we have some configuration that you can change. And there's an environment file where you can just put in your domain. And you can change it to use the Let's Encrypt production. In my example, I'm using Let's Encrypt staging, and I can only recommend when you play around, always play around with Let's Encrypt staging, which is the default in the insert manager, because Roberto knows about it, because he like once tried too often and then was like done with Acme for his domain for a week because they blocked him, right? So you can always switch to a different Acme provider, but really do yourself a favor and play only with the default first Let's Encrypt staging to bring this up. In my case, I did something that is not recommended. I put for this demo, I put the staging root certificate into my browser. Ooh, I shouldn't do that, right? Okay, so what does it contain? So on the one hand side, first we need a one-touch JSON for a first server. We need a one-touch setup for additional servers, and we need a Docker Compose file to bring all the components together. So the OTS for the first server looks like this. First server, blah, blah, blah. The internet domain is a variable, right? Certifier password is a variable, but a lot of stuff in here is not a variable, right? But you see, through this, you have the server setup org certifier password for the ID vault. And this really brings up your first server. And here you see like local domain admins will be set to all the 3 admins that are registered. So we can't go through all the details of this guy. I only give you the highlights, but you can really go to GitHub and get this example and play with it, modify it, borrow from it. This is why we put this up on GitHub, right? So that's the first server JSON. It also registers servers, and one detail that I skipped on the slides is in 14.0, you can specify the server names. So here are 2 new servers that I auto-register. This is all you need to do. In my case, I do something that you would never do in production. On the first server, I put them into local nodes data domino HTML. So it's a lab environment, right? So I say, okay, register those servers. Before they only had numbers. You could put a prefix. Now you can give names. That's since 14.0. And those lines just register 2 additional servers in your lab. So then the next 2 servers, additional servers, they are as additional server setup. You put in the server name and everything, and then they talk to the first server, to Darwin, right? Darwin was first. Of course, Darwin was first. And then later we had Turing, right? Long later. So, by the way, I had to come up with names that are not copyrighted. So I have a Avenger lab, which I could not use for demos. So I put something up that is more something that you can share and work with, right? So maybe I highlight one detail for the first server setup, the search store. So here in search store, I'm looking for an existing certificate and I modify this document to be instead of a micro CA, this is changed to let's encrypt, right? So in here, I say the provider is Acme. A stands for Acme. By the way, this is documented in another GitHub project, all the fields. The status is submitted. The Acme challenge type is HTTP challenge, and the Acme account is actually a parameter that you can specify, okay? And this will really seed a request into the search store. So it's actually updating the existing one. You could have a new one, but we want to override the micro CA certificate that we already have by finding it. So in my case, the find operation is only form equal key file because I only have one, right? Usually when it would be like a more complex environment, you would need to distinguish which one you want to find. But in my case, it's just form equal key file because there's only one. So, and this seeds the request into the database. And when the server starts, the cert manager starts and sees the request and will operate and do it, right? And if it fails, you continue to use your micro CA certificate. But if it works, you get a full-blown real certificate, which is pretty cool, right? But we don't support that with like the normal standard one-touch setup because this is easily something that you can get wrong, and we only want experts to use it. So you are the experts who know how this works, and we can show here how this is configured because this is something that you can do manually with an agent or whatever anyhow, right? It's documented. Okay, let's bring this example up. By the way, it's of course using Nomad, right? Nomad is also in my container image, and there is a variable to set up Nomad with the web server URL. But those are the details that you should know from other installations, that you have to specify which keyring file or which key is used, which TLS credentials is used for the Nomad server. So let me switch quickly to my environment. So let me show you where I am. I'm in the GitHub project. Local GitHub is always my directory structure. And then we have the Domino one-touch setup. This is what I cloned with Git. And here is the Domino lab that I showed you in the browser. So it has all the files in here. And in my case, I modified the environment variables. So this is something that you might already know, for example, from Same Time and other projects. When you bring up a Docker Compose stack, you can put variables in an environment file. So in my case, I'm overwriting the certifier password. I'm overwriting the domain. I give it the right container image. And then I'm using a Docker Compose statement that brings up 3 servers. So you see in here, this is not one-touch templating. This is Docker Compose templating. You see, this syntax looks a little bit different. This is like how how the Linux world works with parameters. So it's taking the parameters from the environment file, and you really see that from here to here, this is the configuration for one of the servers. And when you look into the details, you see in here, I said setup auto configure equal 1. This turns on one-touch setup, right? And then here, I'm mounting read-only the Domino autoconfig template JSON, right? That's the file from my repository, from my current directory. And this is the file where I am. And this is where we mount it into the container. And this really does all the setup. This is doing all the magic. And then we have one more detail here. No, actually, we have two, right? So this is the second server. And the second server is using, instead of the first server setup, it's using, of course, it's having its own name, right? Newton, and then the internet domain in my case. And here it sets a couple of other parameters. So where to get the ID file from, right? HTTP Darwin, and then what is the name, right? And server title and so on. Those are the setup variables that go into the JSON template. And the JSON template is here, the second server, the additional server template. There's one last bit here because the first server needs to be up, right? So we have a depends on. So this guy depends on Darwin. Darwin must be healthy before this guy is started. And then we have a third server that's called Turing. And that guy has exactly the same configuration. The only difference is the server name, right? And you can bring up as many servers as you want with the same configuration if you registered the IDs before. Let's get this started. Let's clear the screen. So you do docker compose up. Usually you would do a detach to do this in the background, but I really want to show you what happens. So you would see all three servers going up step by step in different colors, right? So here you see Darwin is starting. It's extracting its data directory. It's running the server. You see it's running one-touch setup. This is built into the container. And once this is done, the server is there. So here you see template variables replaced. So from here to there, this is built into the container. It does it automatically. And then when all the servers are there, they will talk to each other and they connect to each other because they're in the same container stack, right? So we have to wait a moment because the Darwin server will reboot. So we can quickly see if we can connect to the guy. But I have to warn you, it will stop HTTP. It will stop responding at some point. This is not a problem. This is part of the demo. Yeah, it's gone already. So the server is restarting itself to do transaction log setup. So transaction log setup and collecting the IDs is not something that is done immediately. It's a follow-on process, and it needs to have the server restart, right? So that's built into the container as well. And then after that is done, we have a running server. Actually, we have three running servers. Here's the restart, right? For this for Darwin. And when that is done, we can connect to the server. It will respond to Nomad and also to HTTPS. So it's a working server. And if you look into Nomad, I can skip this and go directly to Nomad. So here's Nomad starting, right? So, and you can log in through Nomad. I think because we have also questions, you see the certificate is here, right? I think we can skip this, right? Graham, I think we are good. So
Yeah.
this concludes all the demos. Let me switch quickly back to the slide deck to see if we have some extras. Probably not. So here's the 3 servers. As a reminder, I have some links, and then I'm still in time, and I'm wondering why. I think we're good.
Yeah.
So questions?
We have 7 minutes and we have 7 questions. So there's your
Ooh.
warning. First question is, in an additional server setup scenario, is it possible to create a Domino cluster?
Yes, but not with one-touch setup. It is an admin P request, and I have added that to the helper. Right, the helper has a way to do it. Lotus Script can do it, but one-touch setup cannot do it. So I have skipped that in this demo because you can't put everything into one demo. At some point, you get nuts when you try to
Yeah.
configure it and about all the timing. It is tricky from timing point of view. Um, I would probably not do all of this at once. But if you really have the need, I have a more complex environment where I set up more servers, and they are all. So I set up an admin server and I set up a cluster. But there is a tricky timing configuration because the servers need to be up and the connection needs to be there. So you really need to know what you're doing because all the servers need to have connectivity first because you need to talk to the admin server to get the admin P requests processed by the admin server, right?
Yeah.
And depending on how you do it, so I had configurations where I put connection documents that I crafted when setting up the additional servers to talk to the first server. So yes, it can be done, but it's really tricky. This is not the first thing I would try.
Okay. Next question, is it possible to create a new LTPA token for single sign-on, or is there a more modern way to
Oh,
implement?
and I explained to Tony that this is not possible because it needs a secret, and that secret needs to be generated and encrypted. So we can try to do that with Lotus script, but also there it's tricky. I looked at the classes, it's definitely doable. The classes use C code, right? But it's all wrapped behind a Lotus script class. Um, you can invoke it on your own. So you create the secret, and then you need to encrypt the document with all the servers to get this working. So it can't be done with one-touch setup. You will not see that Domino is going to do something for one-touch setup with LTPO token because LTPO tokens are legacy.
Yeah.
So when you talk to Dave Kern, he wants to get rid of LTPA tokens as soon as we can because we have something new and cool, which is um, JWT tokens, right?
Yeah.
So this is coming. So you will more see investment in that space than getting LTPA token working. So if you really need to do LTPA token and you want to do this with one touch, you can build your own agent to do it. As long as you don't really need it, you're good also with a single server token unless you have a cluster or a SSO among multiple servers. But this is more like coming from like hosting configurations and if someone wants to build it, it's not that hard. Just submit it to the GitHub repository and we publish it.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, this one's about the one-touch setup JSON. Sometimes the values are in double, numeric values are in double quotes, and other times without quotes, presumably meaning in one case it's a string, in another case it's a number. In some cases, I noticed that the quoted values will fail. Is there any?
Yeah, we need to look into details here. So we um, when numbers in JSON, numbers are without codes. That's it, right?
Yeah,
So if the date type on the Domino side is a number, you have to put it in as a number, else it will fail, right?
yeah,
I would look into my database that can generate the document for you, and you would use the format that is there. It's really hard to get right. in some cases, and you need to know what the field item type is to get it right. And I would save the time in trying to figure out how that works and just grab the agent, put in the document into a database, uh, and grab the JSON.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Next question. Is it possible to create policy settings documents and add ECL settings using the JSON OTS?
Uh, so we have a policy setting that is for the security policy, which comes with ID Vault. This is required. There's nothing else in standard one-touch JSON, but you should be able to craft those documents. But this is probably tricky. If I recall it right, they are matched by response document hierarchy, right? So this should be doable in 14.0, but I've never done it, right? But again, this is like, you don't need to do everything with one touch. You will end up, if you have a complex environment, you will end up having to do something with agents. So the question is really, what do you do with the one touch itself? And what do you do with an agent?
Yeah. I think that answer right there answers the next question too, but I'll ask it anyway. Does it have to be one monolithic JSON OTS file, or is there a way to place JSON OTS snippets into a confd folder?
No, this is only one, but when you look into my database, I do snippets all the time. And you can have you can have building blocks. You can put as many building blocks for a database as you want. The only tricky part is, and that's also in my database, I skipped it. When you create a database, you can only, of course, have one database create statement, but you can have as many follow-on update sections, right, for the same database with documents. So when you look into my database, I put small building blocks with tags, and you can mix and match them and say, okay, for this, I need those documents. For that, I need those documents. And this really gives you a way to modularize your configurations, but they will be part of the same JSON file. So there was an idea for having there's an aha idea, as far I recall, and we discussed about this. And the idea was to have multiple one-touch JSONs to chain, like, but then you would have only the application configuration part. I don't think this makes much sense because it's extra development work. It's not helping you much because you can craft it all together, right? You use a tool to build the JSON and you put it all together. And if it's getting too complex, it's probably not the job of one-touch JSON. That's what I tried to say with my examples about the agents. So this is like, and this is also one takeaway from this presentation, hopefully. One-touch JSON is really cool, but it is not the answer to all your setup problems, right? So especially when you have when you have applications that you want to set up, I would not do this in one-touch setup. I would put this into an agent, get the agent into the environment, and then mix and match, right?
Yeah, I'm glad you
Have
said
a
that
full tool
actually.
set and use the right tool set in the right moment. And this is
Yeah,
probably the hardest challenge in this, right?
it,
To
it,
take
it
all the Lego bricks and put them together.
I'm glad you said that, because when you first showed how you could create databases and add documents, I thought, ooh, that would be something interesting for, different scenarios that I had in my mind. And then when you said use the right tool for the job, I thought, yeah, okay, you're right. Good reminder. No need to try and make things super complicated. Okay, we're over time, but I only have two more questions, so let's try and shoehorn them in. The next second to last question here is One Touch Setup also a solution for install Domino 14 on Debian or Ubuntu?
No, one-touch setup itself is a setup. It's not an install. So if you are interested in install, my Domino start script project has a way to install servers out of the box. You just point it to with curl to the GitHub repository and say install my server. It has the Domino download integrated, which I also use for the container project, and it will install your server. And then the one touch is really completely independent from any distribution, and it works on Windows and Linux, right? So you have to distinguish between I install Domino and I set up Domino. And this does really both. And if you look at it, this is also what has been used for getting the new Amazon Linux image up, right? So we have an AMI from the HCL side that leverages the start script and the build script that is available through my GitHub project, the Domino start script project.
Right. Okay, and last question. You didn't talk about partition servers. The question is, can one-touch setup be used to set up partition environments?
It could set up partitioned environments if you invoke it right and if you get the inis right, because you will already break the system if you didn't put the IP addresses right. So the NRPC port needs to be bound to a specific IP addresses. I personally would go away from partition servers completely. There is no need in 2024 for partition servers unless you run a really large physical Linux hardware and you want to leverage it, or if you're on AX. But with like the environments that we have to do, virtualized environments and containers, I would completely go away from partition servers. By the way, partition servers are not supported by the new feature auto install coming with 14.5. So auto download is there for 14.0. In 14.5, we have auto install. And the complexity for setting up partition servers is just too high than compared to the effort. The value is too low for the effort that someone needs to put in, right? So you can still use partition servers, but really I would go away from setting up new environments with partitions. This is my personal advice. It's not like something that HCL would tell you, but Thomas Hampel has like did a research and like asked questions, like a survey, and partition servers are not playing a major role anymore in deployments.
Yeah. Wonderful. Okay. We went over, but we got it all in. Well done, Daniel. Thank you. That was really, really interesting and informative. We will
You're
have
welcome.
the video posted shortly, and the slides will be available as well. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We're going to wrap it up here, and I wish everybody a good rest of your day.
Thank you, and same for all of you. And stop by the Git repositories and contribute.